Thank you. Thank you so much. And buenos dias. Building inclusive and equitable education systems requires education financing systems that are also inclusive and equitable. And therefore, the first step to achieve this is for states to comply with their obligations set by the international human rights law. Education needs state funding in the first place and not charity or philanthropy. The Incheon Declaration states that all countries should allocate efficiently at least 4 to 6% of gross domestic product and at least 15 to 20% of total public expenditure to education. Despite these clear obligations, according to the Incheon Declaration, there is a 39 billion external financing gap. But this calculation ignores the much bigger domestic funding gap. It is well known that 97% of the new financing needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals on education will need to come from domestic resources. I would like to quickly mention some urgent recommendations the Global Campaign for Education has made for equity-based financing on education. In the first place, building progressive and expanded domestic systems of taxation seems to be urgent. National budgeting for education requires 4 central obligations: increasing the size of the budgets overall, increasing the share of budgets for education, increasing the sensitivity of budgets in order to respond to the most marginalized, and finally, increasing the scrutiny of budgets so governments are accountable to people. Setting progressive budgeting obviously requires tax justice schemes. And this will be a fundamental shift in how the private sector engages with and supports the public sector in education. We believe that private sector has a role to play, but this role should begin with the fulfillment of their tax obligations in the countries where they profit. Taxes are usually set through exhaustive legal frameworks, but many companies work very hard to find legal loopholes to avoid paying corporate tax. Aggressive tax avoidance in order to reduce paying taxes and maximize profits may not be moral, but it's legal. In contrast, tax evasion is illegal. But this is rarely needed when companies can recruit the best accountants and legal advisors to find their way around existing laws. It is particularly alarming that many big accountancy firms are actively involved in advising governments around putting in place new laws and then help their clients to find their way around those very same laws. But something has to give if we are to build progressive and expanded domestic systems of taxation so as to deliver on the right to education. In second place, we need to reflect deeply on the controversial role that some non-state actors play in the national and global governance of education, especially when corporations publicize a message of social responsibility and market themselves as joyful defenders of education without first complying with their obligations to pay taxes necessary to finance education. Participation in national and international policy spaces on education should depend on companies having a reputation for solidarity, transparency, and reciprocity, and paying fair taxes where they make profits is perhaps the most critical indicator of this. And finally, we think that the international community should consider debt cancellation and debt relief to unlock funds in developing countries' budgets and ensuring that the provision of additional finance does not put countries in higher risk of debt distress. We strongly believe that banks should not be empowered to doing business at the cost of any economic or humanitarian emergency. I trust that these critical reflections are useful for the current debate. And of course, you can always count on the Global Campaign for Education to advance new paths of equality and justice. Thank you so much for your attention.